G'day, I'm Martyn Iles, and this is The Truth of It. Today I'll be talking about the fact that Black Lives Matter have admitted that they are a cultural Marxist movement. I'll be answering the question, what is cultural Marxism? And I'll be looking at the issue of victim mentality and why we should avoid it. First up, what is cultural Marxism? Well, Patrisse Cullors is one of the three co-founders of Black Lives Matter, which is the movement that I and others have been trying to point out for a while now is a Marxist movement. And it turns out it's not just me. Cullors herself let the cat out of the bag on the other day when she did an interview with therealnews.com. She defended accusations that Black Lives Matter might not have a coherent ideological framework or suggestions to that effect with these words. She said, "We actually do have an ideological frame. We are trained Marxists." So there you have it, folks. All the commentary on this matter has led me to a point now where I think it's time to answer this question head on by reference to movements like Black Lives Matter. What exactly is cultural Marxism? And I want to answer that by first making this qualification. Not everything is cultural Marxism. It's one of several significant forces that are at work in our culture at the moment that are changing things all around us. There's others, there's postmodernism, the rejection of this kind of the rejection of objective truth, the therapeuticism, the focus on mental health and harm, or just plain old individualism, which we're all very familiar with, which is the turning in on the self and all the various things, and it really is various things that come out of that, where these things are all working in our culture. But one of the significant forces, really significant forces, is this thing called cultural Marxism. Its major end goal is revolution. It is the destruction of, quote unquote, the system. And you need to really understand that about cultural Marxism to get what it's really on about. That's probably the organizing thing. That's the end goal. That's the objective, where it's headed. Cultural Marxism says that the system, which it thinks needs to be completely radically changed and brought down, is broken because it sees the world as a society irreconcilably divided up between those who are oppressors and those who are oppressed. Okay? So you say, well, what's responsible for that? Who's responsible for that? Who's to blame? Well, the thing is, it's kind of everything. It's almost conspiratorial in the fact that literally everything, it's like they have one explanatory principle for everything, that it's all about oppression. It's all about this same thing. It's Western culture's way of thinking, our morality, our language, the way we talk, institutions, just different practices societally, the economy, politics, family, faith, the whole shebang, root and branch. And these divisions, which are oppressor-oppressee divisions, they can't be reconciled. And the system responsible for creating them cannot be redeemed. It is vitiated with oppression. It is shot. Therefore, it needs to go. Therefore, we need the revolution. Now, why is it called cultural Marxism? Well, because actually Marx, who, is the theorist behind classical Marxism, saw oppression solely in terms of capitalism and its exploitation of the worker. That's classical Marxism. But cultural Marxism goes further. It takes it on another step. It expands. It sees oppression more broadly. It says it's not just related to capitalism. This is where everything comes in. But it's also related to a whole bunch of things, especially gender, race, sexuality, and those other identity groups, which we've all become very familiar with. Examples of modern cultural Marxist movements, just to put some practical stuff behind this, are Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, Extinction Rebellion, Liberation Theology, School Strike for Climate, Safe Schools, and a bunch of others, all of which you would immediately know if I mentioned them. And it's not just me saying this, right? Just like I said before, Patrisse Cullors, what did she say? We do have an ideological frame. We are trained Marxists. That's what she's doing. Safe Schools co-founder Rose Ward, she hosts a podcast called Red Flag Radio. She's a keynote speaker at the annual Marxism 2020 conference. And she said a few years ago this, she said, Marxism offers both the hope and the strategy needed to create a world where human sexuality, gender, and how we relate to our bodies can blossom in extraordinary, new, and amazing ways that we can only try to imagine today. There's the goal. Throw off the oppression of heterosexism and all that sort of stuff and get this utopian sort of flourishing that comes at the end. Now, here's a slightly more in-depth case study. Notice the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Stuart Basden. He has a little thing to say here, and I want to go through it and point out the cues to cultural Marxist thinking. He says, I'm here to say that Extinction Rebellion isn't about the climate. Well, shock horror. Remember Ros Ward said, I'm here to say that safe schools is not about bullying. Or if you looked at the interview that I mentioned with Patrisse Cullors before, she actually goes to a very similar place. The guy asks her about that name, Black Lives Matter, the label on the tin. She said, oh yeah, it's not just about the meaning of those words, Black Lives Matter. This is about a much broader political movement. That's a political statement. And so she says basically the same thing. And he says this, he says, you see, the climate's breakdown is a symptom of a toxic system that has infected the ways we relate to each other as humans and to all of life. This was exacerbated when European civilization was spread around the globe through cruelty and violence. Euro-Americans violently imposed and taught dangerous delusions that they used to justify the exploitation and reinforced our dominance. It's worth naming some of these constructed delusions that have been coded into societies and institutions around the world. Note what he's saying. The system is shot. It's vitiated with oppression and violence. It's beyond redemption. And he ties it all back to, Euro-Americanism. Western Civ, whatever you want to call it. And he says it's all broken. This is 100% classical cultural Marxism, and even more so in what he's about to say, because he points out that this vitiation of oppressive forces is all around these tribal divisions that I've been talking about. So he says, firstly, he lists these delusions. He says the delusion of white supremacy centers whiteness and the experience of white people, constructing and perpetuating the myth that white people and their lives are somehow inherently better and more valuable than people of color. So there's oppressor and oppressed in the dichotomy, the division of racial tribes. The delusion of patriarchy centers the male experience and excludes and hinders female-assigned people from public life, reducing them to a possession or object for ownership or consumption. Patriarchy teaches dominating and competitive behaviors and emphasizes the idea that the world is a place of scarcity, separation, and powerlessness. Again, divided, oppression in the area of sex and gender. The delusions of heterosexism and heteronormativity propagate the idea that heterosexuality is normal and that other expressions of sexuality are deviant. Again, oppressor, oppressed in the dichotomy, the divisions around the LGBTQ and heterosexuality and the rest of it. The delusion of class hierarchy upholds the theory that the rich are leader, better, smarter, nobler than the rest of us and make therefore better decisions. That's really much more classical Marxism. He's back to the old capitalism issue, the class warfare stuff. He says there's other delusions. These delusions are becoming ingrained in all of us, taught to us from a very young age. Again, the system's shot, and note this, it's not just the capitalist empire of government, it's not just classical Marxism, the economics and stuff, but even the way we think, the way we speak, the way we relate. He says there very early on, he says the ways we relate to each other as humans and to all of life. It's completely comprehensive, and therefore it's time for the revolution. Extinction Rebellion, right? It's time to overthrow, to wreck the joint. Now, this is a very real movement, this cultural Marxism. It didn't just come up overnight. Let me read to you one more example of an organization. This is called the Combahee River Collective. This is a Boston-based black feminist organization. And I'll tell you why I'm reading this one in particular in just a second, but hear me out. These guys are really clear. They say, we are a collective of black feminists who have been meeting together in the process of defining and clarifying our politics, while at the same time doing political work within our own group and in coalition with other progressive organizations and movements. The most general statement of our politics at the present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression. Right? So there you have it. Before looking at the recent development of black feminism, we'd like to affirm that we find our origins, blah, blah, in the historical reality of blah, blah. And he says, they say the life and death struggle for survival and liberation. So it's that struggle for overthrow. Our politics evolve from a healthy love of ourselves, our sisters, our community, etc. Note this. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. Their words. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. We realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic systems of capitalism and imperialism as well as patriarchy. Although we're in essential agreement, so they're going the same directions entirely. Identity politics, it's all about the intersectionality, the tribes that I belong to, and we need to use that to destroy the system that's oppressing those tribes and those identities that I have. And then they say this. Although we're in essential agreement with Marx's theory as it applied to the very specific economic relationships he analysed, we know that his analysis must be extended further in order for us to understand our specific economic situation as black women. See? More identities, more analysis, more spreading out of the culture, the Marxist dogma of oppression into those areas. Cultural Marxism. And they actually finished with this. They said, we haven't the faintest notion that what possible revolutionary role white heterosexual men could fulfill, since they are the very embodiment of reactionary vested interest power. So thanks, ladies. But, you know, why do I read that? Not only is it so clearly saying what I'm saying in their own words, but here's the thing. Can you guess when that was written? Do you know, if you don't know anything about this group, I bet you can't, because it was written in 1977. That could have been yesterday. Cultural Marxism is real. It's been around for a while. It's having a monumental impact on our thinking today. And I would say in many cases, especially the younger you get, it, to use a word I used before, vitiates your thinking. But I want to notice two things. Firstly, I want to make a practical comment, then I want to make a spiritual comment. Firstly, notice that the key difference with cultural Marxism and other political movements is the difference between revolution and reform. You take the civil rights movement, for example. Cultural Marxism says that the system is irredeemably corrupt and therefore must be ruined completely. Civil rights movement said nothing of the sort. Civil rights movement said the system is actually pretty good, but it needs to be fixed because there's certain people who don't have full participation in this system. There's certain people who are being pushed to the edges, and that was absolutely true. And so they got busy to reform. Fast forward a few decades and America elects a black president in a landslide twice, right? I mean, if you'd said to somebody 15 years ago, what would it take for America to prove that it's given up on racism? I think people would say, elect a black president. That's an amazingly powerful thing. Fast forward a few decades, you've got Western societies with welfare states that seek to benefit racial minorities. They've got scholarships and bursaries for the education of racial minorities. They have legislation to protect the land, culture and heritage of Indigenous peoples. They have tribunals to police acts of discrimination against racial minorities. They have refugee programs to bring racial minorities to freedom. They are integrated multicultural societies that consistently and time again are rated as the least racist societies on the planet by some margin. This is just in the example of race. But see, this is the thing, cultural Marxism, you heard Stuart Basden, he has to go back hundreds of years to talk about European conquest around the world in order to justify what he's saying today. Cultural Marxism is stuck in the past. You know, you can look at any area of society, any, whether it be the legal system, whether it be the welfare state, the economy, human rights, the environment, doesn't matter, I could go on and on. Every part of the so-called system is radically transformed compared to where it was not that long ago. The system is reformable. The civil rights movement was correct. The cultural Marxists are wrong. You know, there's a reason that the world, the whole world, for many decades now, has been desperate to find ways to live in a Western country. Because they're the best countries to live in on earth. They're the least oppressive, they're the most free, they're the wealthiest, they're by far those with the greatest opportunity and peace. Indeed, they might well be the best possible world of all possible worlds hitherto for human beings to live in. You realize that? Any knowledge of history, any knowledge of the globe will tell you that. You know, you've won the lottery of life to be born in Canada, New Zealand, Finland, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Australia. And it just strikes me as mindless arrogance of activists who think that the total destruction of the system in a moment would go just fine. That it'll all be recreated in their own image and the contents of their minds and their abilities is such that that image would be perfect in a moment. It blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind that revolution, they think, of such a system is a good idea, especially when they are the ones perpetuating an angry and resentful and rebellious ideology that has seen 120 million people die in the 20th century, the last 120 years. Come on. It's crazy. That's my practical comment. Let me finish with a spiritual comment. This is, I think, one of the most important observations about this whole thing. There is a far bigger objection than all that I have said. I mentioned several times that at the heart of cultural Marxism is this revolutionary goal. It is the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. That is literally the last line of the Communist Manifesto, so that's what it says. Many say that the revolution targets Western civilization. And I've been criticised on this basis that, well, you're just sticking up for Western civ. Why are you so obsessed with it? Do you know what? That's not actually my concern. That's not actually I'd say my primary concern. My primary concern is something a little bit different, because I believe that the target is something a little bit different. Note carefully, what is it that they call oppressive? What is it that they say is really perpetuating this sin that they think is blighting society and creating victims? What is it against which they are truly rebelling? All these movements, all these suits of clothes worn by what is effectively cultural Marxist movements. Well, you know, it's carefully curated, this list. It really is. It's actually extraordinary. I'm going to read them out to you, and I want you to think carefully about what is it that's the common theme between this list. Let's start with the family. The Black Lives Matter statement is clear. They reject the nuclear family. They all do. Marriage. Cultural Marxists call it patriarchy. Gender. Cultural Marxists say that binary gender is oppression. That's what they're telling your kids so that they can flourish in new and extraordinary ways that we can't imagine, according to Ros Ward. Sex. Heterosexuality is killing sexual minorities. It's oppressing them. It's harming them dreadfully. And we need to cast off those shackles so that anything and everything is acceptable. Children. They're absolutely, totally pro-abortion. Black Lives Matter, again, their statement of what we believe is quite, or their comments on this stuff is quite clear. They champion abortion rights. And do you know that even the UN now calls it the motherhood penalty when women have children and look after them, which is quite sick in my opinion, but there you go. They call it that. Patriarchy. The fact that many who would lead throughout history have been men. Work. The Marxist utopia does not value work as a legitimate means of bettering yourself. It is not an honourable endeavour. Justice. Black Lives Matter, or at least the movement for Black Lives, of which they are a member, wants to defund the police, close down jails, and a host of other things. To read it is quite alarming and extraordinary. They truly do believe that the enforcement of right and wrong is oppression, and it must go. The state. It's a revolutionary movement that seeks to overthrow government as it is. Religion, rejecting religion. And if I had the time, I could go through a whole bunch of quotes from these people about what they say about religion. Marx himself said that religion was the opiate of the masses. All these things, right? I said, think about what is it that ties them together. There is a common theme in this collection. And the answer is that all of these are God's good things. Actually, most of them are what theologians would call creation ordinances. Things that God has baked into the very fabric of the world, the way it's actually been designed on moral principles. And these things are baked into the fabric of the world and revealed to us for our good and for our blessing. Cultural Marxism rejects morality. It rejects good, and it says that those things which underpin all of these things we've just gone through are oppression and oppressive. Marriage is not oppression. Man and woman were made for each other. Children are not oppression. They are amongst God's greatest gifts and the greatest endeavour of anyone's life. Gender is not oppression. It's precisely how you were made, and it forms part of your life's calling. The state is not oppression. It's ordained by God. Justice is not oppression. We all yearn for the day that all evil will be done away with and judged. And we yearn for the day when righteousness will be reigning supreme. Morality is not oppression. God designed the world. He has the instruction manual. He's revealed it for our good because He is good. Cultural Marxism is an astoundingly sinister business. It says that we are labouring in struggle, awaiting redemption, but that redemption is the destruction of God's good things, all of which we see around us are under attack. But here's the great paradox and the revelation we need. Those good things are actually the answer to human needs. They are liberty. The true oppression is living in rebellion against God. That was the truth of it on the important topic of what is cultural Marxism. All right, next up, I want to speak about the dangers of victim mentality. The reason for that is this. I want to make it very clear that my concern around cultural Marxism is not merely theoretical. It's actually quite personal. It's not just about culture wars. This concern is about people first and foremost. Cultural Marxism and victim mentality in general, which is something that other ideologies also perpetuate in some way, but I'm going to keep calling it cultural Marxism for now. This destroys people's happiness, it ruins their psychology, it immiserates them. And let me explain. I want to tell you this. In my late teens, I had to step up and do some work as a youth leader in the church that I was in, teaching kids the Bible, investing a bit in their lives, and that quickly developed into something much bigger. And ultimately became something of what we might call a youth pastor. It wasn't official though. Running a Christian ministry for young people, many of whom were from pretty challenging backgrounds. There was plenty from not Christian backgrounds. We spent a lot of our time with these kids. They were good friends. And we would go out on holidays in boats and buses and all the rest of it and have a good time. We'd get them, we'd do a Bible study program with one group in particular that went over a few years. We studied every verse of the New Testament or every chapter of the New Testament together. And it was really a worthwhile endeavour. And it was a very major part of my life, if not the major part of my life, certainly for about a 5-year period. Now, over the course of that involvement, it occurs to me that a lot of those young people were from racial minorities. A lot of them were African refugees, were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, and other minorities as well. And I kind of got a front row seat to seeing how this victim narrative, this cultural Marxist identity politics narrative played out in the lives of young people. And I want to emphasise with everything that I'm about to say, this only relates to some observations that I had. Plenty of great kids that weren't affected by this in the same way, but there were some that were genuinely affected by it. And I watched what it did to them. I saw this mindset infect the thinking of young people, make them fall into an entrapment of actually resentment and anger. I saw its overwhelming tendency to paralyse them into hopelessness, to make them stop trying, to make them fall back. And you'd come across kids that were full of energy, going from strength to strength. They might even be improving their grades, they might be getting ahead in work, winning awards, perhaps even scholarships. These kids were alive and they were keen. But then they get to high school. Perhaps later they get to university. Then they would be part of broader communities that were hearing the same sorts of messages. And these are messages from their Marxist educators. And the reality is this: it sapped the lifeblood and purpose right out of them. Actually, it made them angry. They lost sight of their blessings, which in some cases were significant, and they only saw their disadvantages, which we all have. They believed the narrative that they would never fully participate in a society that was corrupted by this vitiation of oppression and privilege. And I remember a conversation with one teenager in particular, and he was telling me about the career that he wanted to have, the job he wanted to do, and it was very, very achievable. And I said, well, that's great, and we got talking, but then I realised that even though he genuinely wanted it, he had absolutely no intention of pursuing it. And I queried on that. I said, you can do this. And the response came back, no, I can't. Went through the objective reasons, the academic score needed, the opportunity at a particular institution, etc. Yeah, but I'm black. I said, well, it doesn't matter. There's every race under the sun doing this job. But I could not convince him. I could not convince him that he would not be held back in that role, in that trajectory, by virtue of his skin colour. Which was tragic, because the thing is, every race under the sun is doing that job in large numbers. And he dropped out of his course and never went back. You know, some of these young people, the ones for whom this narrative was very powerful, they sank into paralysis. They lived hopelessly. Sometimes joining criminal gangs, sometimes substance abuse, sometimes no direction, sometimes just no purpose. But of course, as victims, they didn't worry about repenting or changing. They couldn't help it. It wasn't their fault. They heaped up for themselves sins and transgressions and were driven away from the desire to repent because they didn't believe they needed to, because they were victims, and it was the baddies' fault, the oppressors. I saw this destroy families as well, taking away the will of parents to break a drug habit or to pursue their wayward kids or even try and get beyond Centrelink because they believed that this was their destiny as victims of society. It's a tragedy and it keeps you up at night. It's awful to see. Victimhood and cultural Marxism, they are wicked, they are insidious evils, and I have grown to hate them. Now, we're not supposed to hate people, but I think it's okay if we loathe ideologies which destroy people. It's an ideology of concealed racism. It presents itself as being not racist, but it makes victims out of races and it keeps people down in festering hopelessness. It's all-consuming degradation of a person's psychology makes them into its slaves. And I'm not the only one who's seen this. Plenty of people of colour who say the same thing. Dr. Ben Carson, Candace Owens, Larry Elder, Morgan Freedom, Thomas Sowell, so on. And there's in Australia as well. There's lots of them. Identity politics, though, is responsible for a lot of hardship. But see, the reality is that these kids, all young people, are seeing culture, they're going to school, they're being educated, and their political beliefs are being shaped in this way. And it's having a terrible effect on them. You look at the, I read in my last segment the Coomberree River Collective statement drafted in 1977. And this statement is clear. It says, black feminists often talk about their feelings of craziness before becoming conscious of the concepts of sexual politics, patriarchal rule, and most importantly, feminism. The political analysis and practice that we women use to struggle against our oppression. So they're saying basically we needed to be inducted into the concepts that are being taught by this ideological theory before we could see that we were victims, right? And that's what the education system is doing. And they go, we realise that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolved from a healthy love of ourselves, etc., etc. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. We realise that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic system of capitalism and imperialism, etc. And they go on to affirm Karl Marx. Now, why do I read that? Well, because here's the thing. This is what the education system does. It says, look inside, ask, who am I? Answer that question in these categories that this critical theory we're teaching you is giving you. Oh, I'm black, I'm female, I'm this, I'm that, and you select your categories off of the smorgasbord, which is given, and then you say, all right, now I know that I'm a victim. Now I know that in the eyes of society, I am oppressed. And I must fight against that oppression. And I'm angry about that oppression. And this is injustice. And away they go. And I'm a goodie. And the society is the baddie. And the people who don't share my characteristics. It's kind of like this narcissistic individualism which flows over into this sort of Marxist revolution. And this is cultural Marxism. It says, who am I? And that brings about a victim mindset. You know, it's a bit like giving a microscope to a biologist so they can see bacteria. You give a kid critical theory so they can see that they're victims. And that's precisely what's happening. But I want to mention two biblical examples that contrast to what's being taught at the moment, to what we're seeing and hearing all around us, especially in the mainstream media, actually. I'd like to mention the biblical example, firstly, of Cain and Abel, and secondly, of Jonah. Cain and Abel, that's the first story, really, to take place in a fallen world in Genesis 4. And you know, Cain started to see something in his life. He started to see that he and his brother seemed to be unequal in some way, that Abel appeared to have privilege. And the section talks about his favour with God. Maybe he was also the favoured younger son, who knows? But things are good for Abel, and Cain is suddenly becoming aware of this sense that things are not as good for him. So Cain feels that he doesn't have that privilege, and he decides that he's a victim and his situation is unjust. But here's the point, he says it's Abel's fault. And it turns out that even in a society of just one family, there is oppression. But God warns Cain about where his thinking is taking him. He says, sin is crouching at your door. Cain had two options. He could take moral agency, he could take responsibility, he could do right, and he could do good. But he took option B. He let sin in that was crouching at the door. It had its way with him, he overthrew his oppressor. He killed him. And that actually was the true beginning of his pain. Do you know something? Every single person faces challenges in life. Everyone. It's part of the human condition that we do suffer, that our situation is not perfect, that life throws up tremendous challenges. Identity politics doesn't know the half of it. They name a bunch of trendy categories and say, oh, well, you might be oppressed in these categories. The truth is, there's far more categories than that. Life is far worse than they think. The fall in the previous chapter, in Genesis chapter 3, has revealed to us that there's no utopia on this earth. Every life faces its disadvantages. But what we do about those disadvantages is a deeply moral question. The truth is, the most basic struggle we face is not between groups over power. The most basic division is not tribes of identity politics. The most basic division is good and evil, and the most basic struggle is the struggle of my own heart and your own heart to do good and shun evil. And the thing that will oppress you more than anything else is immoral behaviour and rebellion against God's goodness. That is the life of true oppression. It was Cain's biggest problem at the start. Read the story, you'll see it. It was an even bigger problem at the end. That is not to say that there isn't genuine struggles in life that are not our fault. It's not your fault all the time. But here's the thing. How you respond is a deeply moral question. That's the lesson of Cain and Abel. The second story is that of Jonah. And you know, Jonah's story ends abruptly with him sitting in a hopeless despond. And from his seat in the dust, he cries out to God. He says, I do well to be angry. And you know, a major part of Jonah's problem was that he actually believed that he was a victim. I'm sure he did have his share of disadvantages, as everyone who ever lived has done. But his inward self-focus on his own situation bent his whole perspective out of shape. He was commissioned as an evangelist to a particularly godless people. But he didn't want to see others blessed because they didn't deserve it in his mind. He wanted to see them punished. I say, well, does that sound familiar? His prayer was heard from the belly of the fish and God saved him. But he ultimately loses sight of that blessing too when he declares, it is better for me to die than to live. The sun was burning his head when he sat out in the dust, but God caused the green plant to grow up and it gave him shade. But Jonah really only remembered and focused on the loss of that plant because he became very angry over it. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, while he's looking within and he's saying, this is how I feel, this is how the universe is against me, an entire city, and a big one at that, was literally being saved. You know, when you turn in on yourself and you see the world only through a lens of your own disadvantages and miseries, that is through your victim status, and we all have a victim status somewhere and somehow, you become blind to goodness itself. You become angry, and it's a terribly ugly thing. But you know, so long as Jesus lives, you're no victim. Not only do you have all the blessings of God's common grace every day, but he offers me everything, no matter who we are. When we deserve nothing, no matter who we are. Through one Saviour, no matter who we are, who gave up everything for you and for me, no matter who we are, to know God, no matter who we are. Do you know the God of the universe offers every single one of us the greatest equality in the world? And all of us, metaphorically, need to get out of our seat in the dust and realise that, because it changes everything. I'm Martyn Iles, and that was the truth of it. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe by hitting the icons below, and make sure you hit the grey bell as well so you get notified when there's a new video. And if you want to watch more, you can click on the links right about here. Thank you.